Talking God with Uncle Luke. This week, God will die. Oh, come on in. Let's check this out. Luke chapter 18, verse 31 to 34.
All the bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical Channel. Always glad somebody is showing up. Here at the Biblical Channel, we're just trying to keep it simple, trying to keep to the good things of life. We're trying to get from bullshit to the holy shit so we can talk, shoot the shit. Anywho, we just want people to read their Bibles, to say their prayers, to get together and talk about God. Talking God is where the action is. We need to do more of it, not less, and we need to feel comfortable in doing so. And so that's all we're trying to do is help people read their Bibles better here at the Biblical Channel. And I'm Bubba. I'm just a Bubba like anybody else is a Bubba. So to all the Bubbas of the world, come on in. Let's read the Bible. Anyhow, we just want our souls to magnify the Lord. We just want our spirit to rejoice in God, our Savior. That's the way Aunt Mary says it. And I consider all of the characters in the Bible, like Luke to be my uncle, Mary to be my aunt. They're part of the family. When you become a Christian, you become part of the family. And all these characters are like your crazy uncles, your sane uncles, your aunts, your uncles, cousins, the family, man. And so we ought to come to them with the same, love and affection that we do. And Uncle Luke is telling a great story. He is telling the story as it played out and as he laid it out. He's being a faithful guy, and it's up to us to be faithful listeners. So let's, without any further ado, dive in. Crazy title for this week's talk is God Will Die. That's what Jesus is going to say. And let's just read where we are. Luke chapter 18, verse 31 to 33. Jesus takes the 12 aside and he says to them, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles and will be mocked and shamefully treated and spit upon. And after flogging him, they will kill him, and on the third day he will rise. But they, meaning the disciples, understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them, and they did not grasp what was said. That's all we're going to handle. Just these three little verses, because there is so much going on. So in your Bibles, it probably says above this little scene, this is the third time that Jesus has predicted his own death. That is kind of true. It's actually the seventh time. He just didn't say it so directly. He told, stories that concluded that way previously. So this is really the seventh time that Jesus has, taken the 12 or the audience to a place where he makes it clear that his plan is to die. And spoiler alert, as Christians, we ought to get used to the idea that Jesus thinks he's God. And if you're a Christian, then that means you agree with Jesus and that he is God. And so Jesus saying that he will die is the larger picture of God will die. And so why, becomes the big question, what's going on with that? And we can see here the real life human beings, our aunts and uncles like Peter, James, John, all of the disciples who are following Jesus being taken aside once again to be told, hey man, this is the inside track of information. In fact, Jesus says, look, or see, see and look, understand, all goes together. And you could just get that sense that they're all sitting there looking at him like, yeah, what's next, Jesus? Because this is, I don't know, it's trippy for them. They do not grasp it. I love the direct words. They understood none of these things. They did not grasp what was said. And then the in-between bit is that, we're told that it was hidden from them, meaning that God had hidden it from them. So it's kind of, I'm going to jump to the end and talk about that first, this bit of not understanding and it being hidden. And what it brings us to is the age-old topic of free will and sovereignty. Just a quick note on this. This is really the Bible's topic that drives people crazy. You know, it's kind of like the old Bud or not Bud Light, but light beer. Miller Light beer commercials where, tastes great, less filling, tastes great, less filling, and you never get to the end of it. Uh, free will or God's sovereignty, free will or God's sovereignty. You keep debating back and forth, and people. Um, Sadly conclude that you have to have one or the other. You can't have both. Well, as people, we can't have both. But God can have both. He's talented that way. I don't exactly know what that means. I can meditate on it. I can think about it. It's pretty cool that God does it. But the Bible gives weight to both things. Both things are absolutely true, that God gives human beings free will. But another thing that is absolutely true is that he is sovereign. So when the disciples did not understand these things, that is a picture of their free will. And when they did not grasp what was being said, that is a picture of, their free will. But that little bit that it was hidden from them is also part of God's sovereignty. So I think it's just fair to conclude it like this. The Bible, from the very opening pages, gives us this kind of tension between God and humanity, that humanity does have a free will, but that free will never gets above God's sovereignty. In fact, even our evils, God will use for good. The whole book of Genesis concludes with just those words. Joseph saying, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. If you haven't caught our Genesis series, go back and listen to that. We try to do some good work there to help you read Genesis better. But this is a biblical theme through and through. It's kind of like train tracks, that both things are side by side and equally true and equally needed. However, we do have to understand that sovereignty is always over top of human free will, that there's only so much that we can do. Reminds me of that old joke with free will and sovereignty, that the poor old Irish schlep, the hillbilly Irishman, was looking at that Stanley thermos, and he just couldn't figure out how it knows to keep stuff hot and to keep stuff cold. Like, it keeps stuff cold and it keeps stuff hot. How does it know how to do that? Well, that's kind of how we get when we start trying to really solve the riddle of God's sovereignty and free will. Well, anyhow, let's just move on. But it's also very interesting to me that we are no different today. Literally, Jesus and the topic of Jesus and his death and his resurrection, especially his death, seems to be as vexing today as it was back then. It's equally problematic. It's equally difficult for people to wrap their mind around. And I would admit, to my own, first 28 years of life, I had heard of Jesus' death. I kind of, I heard the story, I suppose. I had donned the church a few times, in my upbringing. I wasn't a church kid by no means, but, I kind of heard it, but I didn't get it. And I didn't really care about it. And then all of a sudden, when I was 28 years old, I just call it God slapping me in the back of the head. And it's like my eyes were open. I was like, oh my gosh, this is big stuff. Oh my gosh, there is nothing in the world like this. Oh my gosh. Oh my God. Jesus Christ. I get it. And it works that way seemingly for, people from Jesus' day, from Pharaoh's day. Remember, this is the same tension that we found in the book of Exodus with Pharaoh, that Pharaoh hardened his heart against Moses and the words that God was giving him. But also it tells us that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Both things are going on. When it comes to human beings not understanding things, there's two aspects are not understanding. One is a spiritual aspect, and the other is just us and our stubbornness and our pride, that we just don't really want to sit down and think about it. Because honestly, the death of Jesus is not a huge riddle to figure out. It's not that hard. It's as easy as the fact that the biblical message has three main things to say. Number one, you're on a planet. Number two, you're experiencing suffering. Everybody does. And number three, you're going to die. And then the Bible kicks in to give us some meaning behind that, which is great. that we're on God's planet, that the mess that we're in, the mess of suffering, the mess of injustice that we see in the world around us and even in our own lives is our mess. This is the mess that humanity created when it was separated from God, kicked out of the garden, that kind of thing. And that the reason why we die is so that the mess that we create would be limited. Can you imagine if we all lived forever with the mess that we all keep making? And if we don't make the mess, then other people are making the mess. Imagine if they lived forever. And he quickly sorted out the fact that we have to die to just limit the mess that we make. But this is the simplest form of the biblical message. Not hard to work out, not hard to prove, really. Oh, I know, God made the planet seems to, oh, how do you know that? Well, what's the alternative? What's the comparison? Compared to what? Nothing made everything. Come on, man. I mean, that's a stretch. Anyhow, we need a solution. And that is the story that shapes the Bible. The solution that God gives us to the problem that we have. And God's story to tell from the very beginning of history is the story of, well, the fact that this world is in need of a judgment, and this world is in need of a glory. But judgment comes before glory. But there will be glory after judgment. And sadly, we are waiting for the ultimate in God's glory, but that doesn't mean that we cannot understand things in the here and the now about our own existential life that we live right now, right here, feet on the ground, the average hillbilly life like my own and like maybe yours. But this whole concept that judgment, is necessary before glory can happen is the whole concept of how we get back into the garden that we are out of. How does everything get made right in the end? And in the end, it's God who is going to both bring judgment and glory. And Jesus knows this like no other. Jesus knows that he is the end of God's story. Jesus knows the biblical foundation that judgment will have to happen before glory can ever be. And so he is going to lead from the front. He is going to lead this. And right now, the apostles, no, they don't get it. They don't get it at all because they, like every human being, only thinks of the glory instead of the judgment, only thinks of the resurrection, but not the suffering or the pains and the sorrows that are involved. In fact, when the apostle Peter, after Jesus would die, rise, and be ascended into heaven and reflect back on it, the apostle Peter, writing a letter to the churches, he'll say this. He says that the prophets of old actually searched intently, trying to find out what time and circumstance to which the Spirit of Christ in them was pointing them to, when the sufferings of Christ and the glories that were to follow would happen. You see, Peter will eventually get it. He will get it. And the apostles will get it. And Christians for the last 2,000 years, are on both ends of the spectrum. We don't get it, and then all of a sudden we get it. And when we get it, we're like, wow, that is the most important information that we could have on the planet. And so at its core, the message that Jesus has, that he is going to die, that he's going to suffer the sufferings of this world, and that he's going to rise again, is all related to the solution that God is bringing to the table. It's really not hard to work out. We may call it sin, we may call it rebellion, but this is a problem that God is going to have to work out. And judgment is a necessity. It has to happen. In order for things to be glorious, the judgment will have to happen. And Jesus is going to personify everything that God has been demonstrating previously in his story. It is God's story to tell that the Bible holds. This may not be the way we would do it, but this is the way that God is doing it. And it's a really great story. It's a really great thing that God has done. And the way that God fashions his story is truly remarkable because God actually uses people in the slow motion moving history of the world of people that we know and understand to keep bringing about a clearer picture of what his big story is all about. But the beginning of the story is just as clear as the end of the story, that there has to be an end to the evils of this world, and that there is a promise that God makes to to bring an end to the evils of this world. In fact, if we go back to Genesis chapter 3, where God tells Adam and Eve, or specifically Eve, that I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel, is a picture of what's coming. That the son of a woman, the son of man, is going to crush the head of evil once and for all. But when is that going to happen? Well, that's how the Bible reads. Is it going to happen with Noah? Ends up not. Is it going to happen with Abraham? Ends up not. Is it going to happen with Moses? Ends up not. Is it going to happen with Israel? Ends up not. Because the suffering still continues. The unrighteousness of this world still continues. So we're still looking for that solution, and God is continually revealing the answer or the solution to the problem that the world truly faces, and that is the problem of evil. And there is only one perspective on the planet, the biblical perspective, the God perspective, that what we really need is an end to evil. And that is a part of our imagination that we can hardly even get to. What does it even mean to end evil once and for all? But Jesus, in his little statement here to the disciples about his own upcoming death, he's saying, look, we're heading to Jerusalem. And now that we're heading to Jerusalem, it's all going to come to a head. And he calls himself the Son of Man. And he says, the Son of Man, by direction of all the prophets and what they said, meaning the whole, Bible beforehand, was the work of the prophets through basically 1,500 years of the prophets, kind of leaking out the problem, the solution, and what God was on the move to do. And that Jesus is clearly, playing out the end of the story. The Jesus portion of the story is the end of the story. It's going to complete the story, but the story all along has always been the same. And that is that there must be a judgment before there can be a glory. And so Jesus packs in to this, very simple message. It's not hard to work out, a very rich way of understanding the whole Bible itself. In fact, we might see this, like many other places that Jesus gives us, the way that you should read your Bible. Because when Jesus says that the Son of Man is going to be delivered, according to the prophets, that means the prophets were hinting at this. The prophets had already revealed that this was the way it was going to shape up. And when he says he's going to be delivered over to the Gentiles, this is something that Israel is very familiar with because they too have been delivered over to the Gentiles. Where Jesus is standing in 2,000 years ago, Israel is under Roman management. Israel has not been on their own. Israel has gone through a judgment. Israel is exiled from the promised land. The promised land is not theirs. And they're wondering, when is this going to work itself out? And then Jesus says on the third day he will rise. All of this, Son of Man, delivered to the Gentiles, third day will rise. All of this is a picture of how to read your Bible well. And so, when we, unpack that Son of Man bit that Jesus Jesus uses the Son of Man to refer to himself, but this is a biblical way of talking about human beings individually and also human beings collectively. We are all the Son of Man, and we can be individually a Son of Man. And so this is probably where the disciples get, a bit confused or a bit turned up on end, is they can't work out what they understand the larger picture that we're all the Son of Man, but they can't work out how he is the Son of Man specifically. And that's part of the tension that he says, we are going to Jerusalem. Everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. Now, when Jesus says this and they don't get it, what they would have got if Jesus would have said that we're going to Jerusalem and everything written by the prophets about Israel will be fulfilled, and that Israel will be handed over to the Gentiles, and Israel will be mocked, and Israel will be insulted and spit upon and flogged and killed, that they would have understood. And that Israel will rise on the third day. They would have understood that. But what they don't get about Jesus is why he is going to die. Because Jesus, as the Son of Man, they are thinking, is the solution. He is going to bring the judgment, and he is going to bring about the resurrection, which means the end of days, the last of days. He's going to bring it all together, and it's all going to be over. All the evil of the world is going to be over. So when Jesus, talks about his own death, that just doesn't seem right. So the disciples, to their credit, are probably thinking, well, Jesus oftentimes speaks in parables, and we don't understand those parables all the time. So maybe this is just one of those things that we don't understand. Well, it is one of those things they don't understand, but they will come to appreciate and understand what Jesus was talking about the way we need to understand what Jesus was talking about as well. So that's why we're going through this kind of like next phase. The Son of Man that Jesus is referring to does go the whole way back to Genesis 3:15, where God makes it very clear that the son of the woman, the son of Eve, is going to be the solution to the problem of evil. Now, how that unfolds, through the life of Israel, ends up, being this storyline that never seems to end, because every time we want it to, be the end, it's not the end. And the reason why we know it's not the end is because sin and suffering and evil just continues on. And so Jesus is talking about this Son of Man, as the real solution, as both himself and as the bigger community that will eventually become Israel as well. And this is actually a tension that the Bible always tends to play out. When we read a passage, like God calling Abram. When God calls Abram, he says, I will make you to be a great nation. He's talking about him as a son of man, but also the nation that's going to come out of Abraham as the Son of Man. And that God's solution is to bless not only, Abram's nation, but to bless the whole world through Abram's nation. So this is a tension that has to be resolved. How does that work out? How will God bring his blessing to all nations through the little nation of Israel, who can't seem to get out of its own way? Because, when we just really look at the story of Israel, they're a grand failure. They are disobedient to God. They end up being exiled from the promised land. They end up being, punished by the Gentiles. They are defeated by the Gentiles. And so they see the passages about the suffering servant as themselves as a group of people, but they can't see how it is with Jesus. And that's exactly the point that Jesus wants us to wrestle with. He himself is going to be the whole nation of Israel. He himself is going to be the whole representation of all mankind as God unveils the solution to our problem. And the solution to our problem is the solution to our problem with evil. And so Jesus is indicating that this thing needs to be solved personally. And as Jesus is God, it is God who is going to solve this thing personally by demonstrating it personally. So, all of that, stuff about the suffering is verified in the prophet's message. Many, through, you have Ezekiel, you have Hosea, you have all of these prophets, talking about the sufferings of evil and how the sufferings of Israel, rather, and how the sufferings of Israel are going to find its final vindication in the liberation or the resurrection of God. So the prophet Ezekiel talks about that valley of dry bones. But the nation of Israel always just sees themselves as the nation of Israel being resurrected. They do not see the Gentile world being resurrected. This is their blind spot. This is where they can't really fathom what Jesus is talking about when Jesus is indicating that he himself is going to represent the sufferings of evil once and for all, and he's going to represent the sufferings of Israel once and for all personally. He is going to die as a representative of mankind and the evils of this world by allowing himself to be victimized by the evils of this world. But then Jesus concludes that he will rise on the third day. And once again, it's the prophets who spoke about the rising of the third day. The most telling third day reference comes from the book of Exodus, when the people of Israel gathered around Mount Sinai. And on the third day, God comes to Mount Sinai to visit or to speak. And that's where we get the 10 words, which, the 10 words are really the vows that Israel makes as the bride of God's people, and God is the groom. It's a love story that manifests itself in the 10 Commandments. These are wedding vows. It's a beautiful picture and story if we see it right. But that third day is built into Israel's memory as a significant day that God visited them. So when Jesus says that he's going to rise on the third day, he is indicating that there is a presence of God that is going to manifest itself. But the prophet Hosea also talked about the judgment of God coming upon Israel, and that they were looking forward to the liberation of themselves and Israel. And the prophet Hosea says, "Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us. He has judged us, that he may heal us, that he may liberate us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up again. After 2 days, he will revive us," says the prophet Hosea. "And on the third day, he will rise up, that we may be before him and be ready for that third day." Now, all of that makes perfect sense, because Israel in exile, from the promised land needs to be, they need to be raised up. They need to be liberated. They need to be revived. They need to be resurrected for the presence of God once again, like they understood in Exodus chapter 19, verse 11. So that all made perfect sense to them. But what Jesus was about to do was going to blow their minds, because Jesus was going to embody the judgment of evil himself for the sake of the message and the news getting out to the Gentile world around, and that itself would be the great news that would really reshape the world that we live in today. The world that we live in today has been strangely shaped and forged by the death and resurrection of Jesus. And we could go on and talk about the depth of meaning, and there's a lot more to this. I wish I could tell. We could spend 3 hours on this, but I gave you just a leap forward into the depth of what Jesus is referring to when he says that the prophets must be fulfilled, that God's story must be completed, and he is the completion of that story. But this world has been forever changed by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The whole idea of equality, the whole idea of compassion and consent and enlightenment and even science and freedom and progress has come from the people who have responded to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Yes, indeed, for 2,000 years, people have understood, and they get it, and they get on to the business that we should be, into. And the day will come when Jesus will come back again, and judgment will happen for its last time, and glory, in all of its glory, this creation, this planet that we live on, will be right where God wanted it from the beginning. God will get his way. Jesus will get God's way on our behalf. Time to join Team Jesus. That's what I say. Okay, that's what we got. Catch you next time.